So we're going to talk about, you're going to hear me refer a lot to classroom management. I get that in the various positions people have, it doesn't necessarily take place in a classroom. There are lots of different settings in which how we manage behaviors is taking place. So I'll sort of refer to it that way, but you can broaden out the sort of setting in which things happen for you in your interactions with kids. But if we talk about managing behaviors in the class, I think the image that comes to mind is often the idea that what we're trying to do is control an environment so that we can jam the curriculum in, or get through the material that our administrators are asking us to get through, and it really has much broader implications than that. Broader implications for the mental health development of the child who's the specific focus maybe of a behavioral program that we have in place. Broader implications for other kids in the classroom who see you managing difficult behaviors in the classroom and who therefore understand the classroom to be a safe place in which they can exist. So it really sort of extends far beyond what we sometimes are asked to do if we're implementing part of a behavior plan that's in place because we've had a kid who's presenting with some difficulty. I don't know how many of you, some of you who have come into contact with what's traditionally been called school-based mental health. You'll hear it referred to as integrated mental health team coming up. But I don't know how many of you have sort of had people through school-based mental health coming into your classroom setting to work with kids. I don't see a lot of nods, so not yet, but you will. And this is, I think if you look at school-based mental health has been a part of the district for probably 20 plus years now, close to 25 years. And this is where, for difficult problems that you might be encountering in the school setting, kids who have a mental health diagnosis, families where there are diagnoses but who have a child in the school and where the family is actually causing difficulties for the school, there's a team of individuals, some of whom are outside providers, mental health providers, who come in sometimes to address those issues, partner with the schools to address those issues. The Penn State Psych Clinic is one of those partners, and we've been sort of involved since the beginning of that. I've only been here 11 years, but I've been a child psychologist for almost 25 years, and involved in mental health services in the schools for the majority of that time. So along the way, you're going to end up encountering some of these outside providers who come in, and I think what we do in the classroom to sort of set a tone for kids, to manage behaviors when there are difficult behaviors in the classroom, is important when it's part of an actual treatment, right? So what happens in the classroom is often can be viewed as adjunctive to certain treatments. In the same way that Big Brothers Big Sisters is a program that is not necessarily therapeutic in and of itself, but could be a really important component if there's an external treatment that is focusing on the social development or emotional development of a kid, and having a big brother or big sister in place can really help to sort of accelerate some of what's happening in the treatment. And sometimes what's happening in the classroom really is part of the treatment itself. If I'm treating a child with an anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, I'm often partnering with teachers in school because there are exposures that are going to take place in the school setting where a kid is they have homework assignments through the therapy that take place during the school day. And so we partner with the schools about what that part of treatment might look like. So it really is kind of a more direct part of the treatment. But I think, the topic is a little bit vague, right? Mental health implications for managing behaviors in the school setting. One interpretation is about mental health problems kids bring into the classroom setting and what that means for you and your management of their time. I was interested in sort of the other part of that, which is how what you do in the classroom, how what you do in your time with a child promotes positive development in a way that actually cuts a cycle off. And I know it's easier to sort of feel overwhelmed by sometimes what kids are bringing in, but you're going to end up dealing with a lot of kids who don't have problems, who may have problems on the horizon, but where those problems are actually undercut by the tone that we set in the classroom. I think that's the more positive interpretation of implications for classroom management on mental health functioning. This is, I'll let you sort of read the quote for a second. this is by someone who's a classroom teacher, a classroom teacher in Israel, also happened to be a child psychologist and a psychotherapist. I think it's a pretty bold statement about the impact that teachers have on the life of a child, the role that teachers as managers of a child's environment have on the development of the child. It's maybe a scary proposition, the influence you have over a child. But if you think about the fact that you have a child in your care, depending on the level where you have that child, but sometimes for 7, 8 hours a day, for significant portions of their day, from the perspective of a parent, I have 2 kids in high school, my kids are out of my home far more than they're in my home. And what happens out there influences their behavior as much as what I'm trying to do in the home. Our influence is pretty far-reaching, and the tone we set makes a huge difference. The same gentleman also made a quote that said, rebellion follows rejection. And that's actually a quote that's used by psychologists a lot. Rebellion follows rejection. You get the rebellion part in the classroom. We sometimes get it as parents. Where the rejection takes place doesn't necessarily take place in the same setting. And I think this is one of the difficulties in being a classroom teacher, being an instructor in schools in a variety of ways, that you're often sort of dealing with the fallout from things that played out in a completely different setting, rejection that took place within the family. I have to imagine that we could sort of go around the room and every single one of you could identify the difficult families, or give examples of difficult families that you've dealt with over the course of this school year, and whose kids come into the classroom with difficult behaviors, right? Often rebellious behaviors in the class that may have to do with something like a rejection elsewhere, and yet that doesn't diminish the role that you play in trying to create some positive pathway for a kid to break the gravitational pull of what might be a really difficult family and get on a different path moving forward. So we're not going to talk a lot about disorders. I'm sort of putting this up to just to sort of highlight, if we think about sort of very common disorders that we deal with in kids and the kinds of symptoms that are associated with them. Just to highlight sort of what sometimes feels like the overwhelming nature of the problems that kids often bring with them. And I'd say this is probably a bigger deal for the people here because we're talking 6 to K, right? It's easy if we sort of shift down in time and think about what we might do as far as management in a classroom, the role we play with kids who might be just transitioning into the school experience, kids in kindergarten or first grade, or who are very early on in their school time, and where a lot of these things aren't going to play out until a later point in time. If you look at the nature of the disorders, many of these things we typically think of as emerging when a kid hits adolescence. So eating disorders really typically aren't in play. Now the caveat here is that more and more, and this is the frightening trend in the field of mental health, but more and more for a lot of these disorders that we really used to think of as adolescent and adult disorders, we see them trending down. You now see kids with obsessive compulsive disorder who are pre-adolescent, and that didn't used to be the case. Now I'll argue with you about the misuse of bipolar disorder as a label, but we're seeing kids with bipolar disorder at a much earlier point in time. We've got a debate about whether those are actually appropriate labels or not. We see kids with some rising eating problems early on. That really used to be an adolescent disorder. So for a lot of these things, these were problems that emerged during the period you have these kids, 6th grade and beyond. We're actually seeing them occur much earlier in the elementary schools. We're dealing with things that just didn't used to be on the radar for them. So in our discussion today, I don't necessarily want to focus on disorders coming into the classroom. The focus is really about management strategies more broadly, and we'll sort of apply those to how this helps set a kid on the path that we're looking for without necessarily getting too caught up in what are we doing about a specific disorder. We'll leave time for discussion. If people want to get into specific behaviors, specific kinds of problems, we can do that, but the focus is a little bit broader, sort of where we're beginning. I don't know how many people sort of at one point or another actually were working with kids in elementary school. I mean, how many of you at previous points in time were dealing with elementary school? Right. So it's such a different experience. And I know here a couple of years ago they had the PATHS curriculum in kindergarten. And so you get a lot of focus on prevention and early intervention, right? A lot of universal programming for kids. Like PATHS is a curriculum integrated into the typical school curriculum that promotes social and emotional development. And so it's just kind of infused into a child's day, but in kindergarten, in a way that sets a kid up for a better first grade and second grade and third grade experience, and potentially cuts off, some difficulties that otherwise might come. All right, we don't have those same sorts of things that are easily integrated at 6th grade and 7th and 8th grade. Certainly not universal, because by the time you have a kid in 6th or 7th grade, a lot of problems are in place. I mean, a lot of problems are sort of walking through the door. So, but at an earlier point in time, when these things aren't necessarily in play, it's easier to put prevention and early intervention in place and to really sort of make a difference. I think that's where the trend is. I think that's where the money is, and Nikki could speak to sort of where the states like to put their money. We're seeing more. States didn't want to talk about prevention historically, didn't want to talk about early intervention, and now we're seeing more money being allocated in that direction, because the money they spend to deal with disorders that are showing up in 6th grade and beyond is outrageous. So we'll sort of move beyond the idea of disorders and think a little more broadly than that. And as we're talking here, by the way, again, in discussion we can talk about, the focus on management was not intended to mean the focus on managing a symptom of a disorder coming in. It's really talking more broadly about management of the classroom, so not necessarily dealing with the disorder. We can get into both of those sides, but they aren't necessarily, I think the line between the two is probably a pretty thin one, but our focus is a little broader than that. So what I want to do today is I want to walk through sort of some general strategies that we might implement in the classroom. By the way, these really line up with strategies that we regularly use for parents. And I'll talk about that sort of briefly before we get into that. And just as we're doing this, and then we'll talk about sort of their application to some specific examples, and really how these things do feed into the promotion of positive mental health for kids. One of the really interesting things about established parenting programs is they all tend to be about the same length, 8 to 10 sessions long, 8 to 10 weeks long. And if you tear them apart, they all really focus on the same strategies. And you'll see that these are things that are also part of what we typically talk about if we're thinking about classroom management. So most parenting programs, there's a program called The Incredible Years. This is developed at the University of Washington. There's a guy named Rex Forehand, Georgia, who also has a parenting program. Russ Barkley, who's like this big guru of ADHD, has developed a program for dealing with difficult teenagers. And if you break them apart, they actually all contain exactly the same elements, right? So we have a module that's about catch your kid being good, which simply is about the use of reinforcement to acknowledge a child's appropriate behavior and to make sure that the ratio of attention for appropriate behavior far outweighs the times that we're paying attention to kids for the stuff they're doing wrong. There's a lot of attention on giving effective commands, which we'll talk about here in a second, and how we actually are talking to kids and kind of prepping them for the behaviors that we'd like to see. What parents come in wanting is this other piece that's included in all parenting programs. How do you do timeout? Parents usually walk through the door saying, give me the punishment card for this difficult child I have. And timeout is always a part of these programs, but it's at the tail end of these programs. It's front-loaded with the ways that we want to reinforce kids and talk to, communicate with them in effective ways and use charts and all sorts of things. And then at the tail end, how do we use certain negative consequences for problems that we're encountering? And I'd say the same strategies should be applied in the classroom, really is typically the focus in the classroom. So, for example, in a general sense, if we're talking about kids who can be problematic in the classroom, that we want to try to some extent do some talking in private, and we'll talk about why that is as we move along here. Keep things calm, and I'd say if you, as we're talking, if you're putting yourself in the position of being a parent, for those of you who are parents, or in whatever setting this sort of makes sense for you as a child, of a parent, it's very easy for things, for discussions at home to cycle into arguments. And within families, we all have roles that we play. We all fall into those roles easily, and there's a reason why every discussion often seems to cycle into the same outcome. I'm yelling at you, and you're yelling at me, and I'm walking away, and I'm slamming a door, and you're yelling outside the door, and so we talk a lot to parents about how to engage our kids in a dispassionate way, right? How to remove sort of the emotion from what it is we're trying to convey to kids, which is that they have choices to make about their behaviors. There are consequences associated with those choices. We hope they make good choices, and we want to guide them in that, but ultimately, we can't push our buttons when that happens. And I think it's very easy for difficult behaviors in front of us, whether it's in the classroom or at home, to activate elements of us that just can send us through the roof, right? And I've seen teachers get very upset in the classroom with the kid because it's a behavior they've seen every day over an extended period of time. But maintaining a sense of calm in the face of a difficult child is kind of a critical element. And some of these we'll sort of just cover as we go through some specific examples. I said one of the pieces that you see in all parenting programs is giving effective commands. And as simple as it sounds, parents are great about looking for shortcuts in the way that they communicate with their kids. And I say this as a parent who I teach parenting stuff. I work with parents on a daily basis in our clinic, and I teach this. And I can point to you on a daily basis the ways in which I cut a corner when I'm communicating with my own kids, right? So if we're talking about how you give effective commands, it's things like you want to be in close proximity to a child. So rather than yelling across the room, or rather than my yelling to my teenage son up in his bedroom, to come down so we can talk about something, I actually have to get up and take some steps and get in close proximity. But that messages aren't delivered through walls, and they're not delivered around corners, and they're not delivered down basement stairs, but that we're actually there. We can make eye contact, so your kid is listening to you. That commands, instructions are short and to the point. So as parents, we love to explain things. Let me tell you why I'm telling you this, and I'm going to tell you 3 times, and I'm going to tell you over and over and over again, and I really want you to understand this, and this is based on experience, and I know you don't get it right now, and your kids just, eventually the messages are sort of in one ear and out the other. So instructions, how you doing, Matt?
I'm good.
Good. So instructions are short and to the point, and instructions are truly instructions, not questions, right? And so we tend to drift into using questions. Don't you think it's time to go to bed, or don't you think you should be getting ready for bed? Now you've opened the door for your child to say, no, I don't think so. Or don't you think it's time to brush your teeth? No, I don't think so. Now, lots of kids don't pull the challenge out immediately, but you phrased it in a way that leaves it open to discussion. If it's time to go to bed and that's what you're trying to convey, then it's a statement, it's not a question. You need to get ready for bed. I need you to do this thing. As opposed to creating something. And then parents can understand why the kids take the bait, and it becomes a discussion that they never wanted to take place, but some of that has to do with the way that we're communicating. So, we don't yell from the other room, we get in close proximity, make eye contact, commands, not questions, short and to the point. Parents also tend to chain things together, so we don't want to chain commands. But parents chain things together. I need you to go upstairs, get your pajamas on, brush your teeth, wash your face, and I need you to give the dog a little bit of extra water, and what you find is 5 minutes later the child's just sort of drifted off to Xbox or Wii or watching a little TV or something. And you say, well, what the heck's going on? And they lost it somewhere between my pajamas are on, and then there was something else I was supposed to do. And now my wife would say that this is a little like sending me to the grocery store with just the 3 things. I got it. Yep, I got it. The 3 things I'm going to get. And then I'm texting from the store going, and that second thing was what? The third thing was what? We have a system now, which is just she has to text me the 3 things. But so my wife has made the mistake of chaining together the grocery list, chaining it so that as if I'm going to remember all this stuff. And parents will do this, where we give you the 4 things to do, and the child drifts. There's also an element here that's important, which is by doing so, even if your child were able to get through all 3-4 steps, is you lost the ability to reinforce them along the way. What we really want to be able to do is catch our kids being good, reinforce their efforts in doing things. So I need you to get your pajamas on, tell me when you're done. Means you now have the opportunity to say, hey, that's a great job, that was really quick, now I need you to brush your teeth, tell me when you're done. Great job brushing your teeth, you're doing a nice job tonight, I need you to wash your face and so forth. But those little bits of reinforcement along the way are what help to ensure that this behavior is going to occur again. All right, same thing in the classroom. To the extent possible, right, where we want you to be sort of nomads in the classroom, I know that's not always possible, we're all tethered to our technology, but to the extent possible, where you can be out in the room, it's the drive-by reinforcement, right, where it's I stop, I instruct, I also make sure I have a chance to reinforce kids who got their instruction 2 seconds ago when I cycle back around. But commands are more easily given when we can make sure that we're next to the child and doing it in a short and sweet way, and it really is about something we require, not a request we're making of the child that then leads to some discussion, that sort of goes awry. Interestingly, probably no concept, either in the classroom or at home, seems to bring up as much debate as the use of reinforcement. Sounds simple, right? Kid does something well, pat them on the back, tell them they're doing well. I can't tell you the number of times, certainly within a clinical setting, that parents raise the question, why should I reinforce my kid for doing something he should be doing anyway? That wasn't the way I was raised. I don't see the need for it. It's not part of my personality. I'm not warm and fuzzy. That psychology stuff is, insert your expletive here, but this idea that a simple reinforcer is somehow leading a child down the wrong path because it's reinforcing a behavior that just should occur naturally. Look, if child behavior is unfolded naturally and every kid was on the right path with absolutely no guidance, you'd be out of a job, I'd be out of a job. It doesn't occur that way. But parents really struggle with this question about how do I reinforce my child? And even once on board, right? So if I could get everybody on board with the idea that, look, giving a kid a pat on the back for being able to demonstrate a skill for you or show you the behavior that you want to see in the classroom is a good idea. We could still then debate, okay, how often is this thing supposed to occur? In what form is it supposed to occur? And the fact is, here's the basic concept that we're shooting for, that in whatever setting we're encountering a child, we want to catch this kid being good where the ratio of the attention that we're giving, I mean, this is really about, all of you have dealt with your FBA stuff this year, this is really about the function of the behavior. To the extent that some childhood behaviors, not all, but some childhood behaviors are to seek attention, right? Pull in parents, even negative attention, and this is where I think parents struggle. How can my standing over my child yelling at them for problem behavior, how can my getting into this argument with my child in any way, shape, or form be reinforcing? And the fact is, negative attention is better than no attention at all. If a child is devoid of affection and attention from attachment figures, then they'll bring it in however they have to. And if the way you get mom's attention, dad's attention is acting up, then they'll act up, because that's when the parents suddenly get off the couch and get drawn in. So what we're shooting for here is a ratio that's, we always argue like 10 to 1 would be great. We never achieve that, but a 10 to 1 ratio of catch them being good to times when our attention is being given for a problematic behavior, right? And this is, in parenting practices, this is step number 1. This is the first thing we do, first thing we teach. And the need then for time out and some other practices that parents are often pulling for diminishes greatly. Parents, actually, this is where you can look brilliant in the eyes of a parent, where you start doing things like catch them being good, and within a week or two, the problem behaviors have just fallen off the table. I mean, the numbers have dropped drastically, and all we did was take parental attention and shift it to catch a kid being good. Now, the parental counter-argument, and obviously I'm talking about parents and parenting, but there's a parallel in what we're doing in the classroom. The parental counter-argument is, but my God, he's so difficult to deal with at times, that when he's sitting doing something, when he's watching television, when he's reading a book, when he's playing on the Wii, when he's doing this thing, that's my respite. I just want to breathe. I just want to put my feet up. I just want a moment of time, right? That's when you just sit back, pop open a beer, just, this is my 5 minutes. And I'm waiting for what I know tonight's cycle will be, which is an argument about bedtime or a homework completion or something, but I need these few moments to get fueled up for that. And nothing could be more wrong. What we want to do is really pay attention to the times when our child is giving us a glimpse of a behavior we want to see occurring more often, whether in the classroom, whether at home. Now, parents, Well, again, the counter argument is, oh, no, he never gives you those moments. No, it's right, their argument is this, he's a demon seed, he's just, the horns are under the hair, I'm sure of it, and I don't see any of those behaviors. Now, that's not true, and you really have to work with some parents to identify these flashes of neutral behavior the child might present, non-argumentative behavior. Define it however you think is necessary. But when those things are happening, the time when a child sits still for a few minutes, the parent has to jump on it. Hey, you know what, I really like it when you're quiet like that, or I really like it when you're reading like that, or I like it when we have sort of some still moments or something. I actually have a list of like 100 ways to catch your kid being good, and phrases you can use so that it's not a repetitive kind of dry process with them. But you have to make sure that you're hitting kids with these opportunities, just a quick reinforcement. Now, parents will say, I don't want to interrupt it. If he's sitting reading a book and I come by and I reinforce, now I stop that activity. So I've actually stopped the thing I want to see. Now, I think what they envision in terms of the reinforcement is the idea that like you swoop the child up, right? Oh, this is wonderful, you're reading a book and this is tremendous and I just love it when you do that. And, and that's not what so now we have to teach parents how to appropriately walk by, hand on the shoulder and say, hey, you know what, I really like it when you sit and read quietly. It's hit and run. I'm in the room, I pay attention, I make sure they see that I'm reinforcing, in close proximity to eye contact, I reinforce and off they go. And we just keep doing it. We cycle through and we make sure that we're hitting this regularly. If we did nothing else in parenting for behaviors that are driven by attention seeking, you see a dramatic shift in negative behaviors compared to positive behaviors. You see a tremendous decrease in negative behaviors and an uptick in positive behaviors. Kids start to absorb this. They want it, right? They start to sort of seek it out, as opposed to needing to get into the fight with a sibling because that's when you get up and jump into it. And again, it's very easy for us to want to just sort of put our feet up, take a moment to relax, and only jump in when things are difficult. And when I said earlier, on a nightly basis, I can point to things, places where I know I'm sort of cutting corners. That's an easy one. Because you've had a long work day and you sit down and you just want to sort of relax, and you have to force yourself to sort of get in and do these things. And the argument is this, and I make the same argument to you in the classroom, that, because another counter-argument is about the time. Oh my God, then I feel like I'm constantly sort of getting up and seeking this out and reinforcing, right? And it takes a lot of time to do that. And I ask parents, how much time are you investing in dealing with the problem behavior? And in school, how many meetings do you have to deal with the problem behavior? How many team meetings are taken up by that kid and that behavior? How many meetings where the parents have to come in? How many issues in the classroom where you're getting pulled away from something you really want to be spending time doing in the classroom to deal with the problem behavior? All I'm asking you to do is take a portion of that time, invest it differently, and I'll give you the time back at the other end. But right now, parents often are sort of arguing with kids late into the evening because we didn't set up something earlier. So let's invest it here, get the time back later, and that's actually not a bad exchange of time. And again, if you can get parents on board with that idea, you really get nice changes. The same thing in the classroom. And the other difficult thing in the way we want to implement this is you have to be incredibly consistent in the way that this stuff plays out. Now, as a father of two, I don't know how you do it with a class of 20 or 25, or in my moments are to sort of swoop in, right, give advice and work with the team. But having 20, 25, marching band, how many kids? 200, yeah, right, who are all seem to want to move in a different direction before you can get them organized for this evening's activities. It's incredibly difficult to feel like you have a consistent experience day to day, and yet kids crave this consistency. Like the themes throughout parenting, the themes throughout classroom management are about consistency, structure, and warmth. You put those three things together, and you can really create a positive experience for kids. The consistency, this idea that I have an adult in my life I can count on, right? And again, I know sometimes it feels like we're kind of fighting the tide if we have a family that's really struggling and scuffling, and a kid coming in, and you know there aren't good role models at home, or you at least suspect that there aren't good role models at home. And here you are being asked to not only take on the instruction role that you have, but to do some parenting as well. And the fact is, well, yes, and that is your lot, and it's important in this sense. I don't need you to be the parent, school doesn't need you to be the parent, but they need the same principles we would ask parents to employ to occur in the classroom for a kid to be able to say, when that teacher says something, I know I can count on it. When they structure the classroom and control it and make sure that, behavior problems that arise are addressed quickly, I can count on that, so this is a safe place for me to be. And this isn't a teacher who hates me tomorrow because I had a difficult time in the classroom today. And I'd say being warm and engaged with a child on a regular basis is really difficult because we all know there are some kids who can truly push buttons and who really bring into the classroom a sense that they're engaging in willful behavior, right? That they're coming in looking to tick you off today, that this was their mission in life, that they charted on the bus how to tick people off. Okay, step A, step B, and of course by the time things really explode, that it was a well planned out curriculum for them. You've got your curriculum, they've got their curriculum, and their curriculum is push buttons. And I can't argue enough that this, we don't think of this stuff as willful behavior. We are all creatures of our learning histories. We're all creatures of our patterns of reinforcement. And so we get drawn in the direction of things that have been reinforcing for us, and we eliminate behaviors that haven't been very reinforcing for us, right? If you hang out with your friends, and if you have people who tend to laugh at the jokes that you make, lo and behold, you find yourself just spontaneously spending more time with them. Not by design, it just happened. But that's part of a learning history. It's like drafting in NASCAR. You draft towards the things that are reinforcing for you. Well, kids do the same thing. And keep in mind, so if we see a negative behavior occurring in the classroom, and this is where attention comes, and obviously you control part of attention in the classroom, yours, but now you've got those 20-something other kids in the classroom who thought what that kid did was just hilarious, or who all want to see what the stage show is today with this kid, and managing those elements of attention are often a lot more difficult. But if we can manage, where the attention is being given and how the reinforcement is being given, we get sort of a response that we're looking for. But this idea of consistency and warmth in the classroom is easier said than done. And I guess the one more thing I'd say about that is that we talk a lot about a relationship with a student, and it can sound very psychologist-like to talk about the relationship piece, but I do think it's important. And I would guess that when all of you got into teaching, it wasn't because you said, God, I think the district has a great curriculum, and I just can't wait to speak it out loud. I really can't wait to lay this out on a daily basis. That's why I got into teaching, is because of the, and maybe you just get psyched about this math versus that math. And you're all, those of you who are like that are probably headed towards administration. No offense, Gene. But most people get into it, right, for the relationships with kids, the connection that you'll make with them, the influence that you have over them. And I'd say that part sometimes gets overwhelmed when you get into the position, and it does become about the curriculum. Every meeting, right, is about the curriculum and what we're putting into place and all the things that sort of have to be loaded into the classroom. It's easy to push the relationship piece aside. That's kind of a secondary thing. You hope it happens. You want to be nice to the kids, and you hope they're nice to you. But the relationship piece is really core and critical for kids to be able to experience what happens in 7 hours of their day, if not more, if they're involved in extracurricular activities, to take those experiences and actually be able to take it home in a way that sometimes changes the patterns there, because I'm not going to put these behaviors on display for mom and dad, right? The ideal thing is we get home and school kind of working in concert on this stuff so that the changes you're making are also being reinforced by parents. That's sometimes easier said than done. But it helps us not lose that relationship piece when we're putting these things into place, right? So, if we're talking about just though that the way some of these things, difficult behaviors in the classroom tend to peak. There's a nice website, by the way. For any of these slides, I don't usually make handouts because it's difficult to count the number of people, and I often sort of do 11th hour changes. But you know, if anybody wants the slides, you can give Nikki a heads up, or I'll just provide it to Nikki and you can let Nikki know, and they can be forwarded on. So, but there's this nice website for the Iris Center, which is affiliated with the University of Maryland, and it has a lot to do with school psychology and classroom management. There's some nice resources there. But if we look at sort of the way some of these things occur in the classroom, it's very easy sometimes to have a kid blow up in class for whatever reason, whether it's affiliated with a disorder, whether it's a kid who otherwise has been sort of off the radar and who presents with a difficult behavior. And the experience of it is, the report of it, if I meet with a team, is it just came out of nowhere. It just happened. He was great, he was sitting there quietly, and then kaboom. And I'll tell you, it never happens that way. There's always a cycle to it. There's always a reason a kid goes from, you know, I'm able to walk across the threshold of the school in reasonably good health and exhibiting reasonable behavior, to why in your classroom in this moment I'm showing you something different. Now, that doesn't mean that something happened in your classroom. It can be because the kid didn't get a good night's sleep the night before. It can be because the parents didn't get breakfast in the kid in the morning. It can be because of a fight on the school bus coming in. It can be for all sorts of things that are completely off your classroom radar. But you can have a kid who comes in, triggers already in place, or agitation already in place, and sort of ready for the explosion to happen if there's something else that takes place in the classroom. But even kids who come in, great night of sleep, they had breakfast, all the good things are happening, can still have triggers that set them on a course where it's going to end up being a bad day. And the triggers can be, you know, difficult material for a kid who doesn't feel very efficacious about being a student and being able to handle things. Triggers can be, and this is particularly relevant in the middle school, when kids encounter things like transitioning from class to class to class for the first time. So triggers can be the bull rush in the hallway, right? Getting from class A to class B in 2 minutes with, and when you're a boy in 6th grade. 6th grade's an interesting age because the girls all look like Amazons and the boys all look like they're never gonna grow. And then by the time they get from 6th to 8th, you know, the boys start to shoot up and there's a big difference. But if you walk down the 6th grade hallway, it's all the girls are here, all the boys are here, and you have just this mad dash from one place to another. But for a kid who has an autism spectrum disorder, for a kid who has social anxiety, for a kid who's had conflicts with others in school, who doesn't necessarily have any sort of disorder in place, these can all be triggers that get flashed at him or her in the 2 minutes from one class to another, where they're now walking in and you're asking them to pay attention to instruction, and they've got, you know, part of their brain on the experience they just had in the hallway, and it sets them up. So they encounter the kid they don't do well with in the hallway, and now you start placing demands on them in the class because there's some work we have to get through today, and you're kind of, you know, you're trying to sort of push it through, and go from a kid who's a little bit agitated to a kid who's accelerated. There are absolutely places we can sort of address things. When I'm talking about these general strategies, right? How do we communicate? How do we give effective commands? How do we reinforce behaviors we want to see more often? All those things, we're talking about hitting kids really early in the process. These are not the things you do with a kid who's agitated. The kid who's agitated, really getting out of control in the classroom, who calms down for 2 seconds, now's not the time to say, hey, that's a great job calming down for that second. We're sort of beyond that point. So the strategies we've been talking about are these things that we can implement regularly, hit them early and often and regularly, because it's actually what prevents some of this stuff from occurring. And if the kid's experience of you is that you're a positive authority figure in his or her life, then when the agitation is occurring, when they've had a bad experience, you're stepping in and giving them a few minutes and trying to give them an ear, even just for a few minutes out of the classroom, is sometimes what brings them back down from this state of agitation. So the strategies we've generally been talking about are not sort of how do I jump in the middle of a big problem, it's how do I set the stage so that I have fewer issues playing out in my classroom than I otherwise would if I'm just, you know, praying, thanking God that it was that I've had this great class, and just sort of hoping we don't have too many problems. And I think having sort of consulted in enough classrooms, I could give you a rating form and ask you, hey, rate the class they gave you this year. Rate some of the kids you have. And everybody knows there are teachers who will walk around, saying, I got shafted this year. Man, did I get shafted. Let me tell you about the constellation of kids I have. And other teachers who are going, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to jinx it. I'm flying below the radar because I feel like I got pretty lucky. Okay, may be true and may be obvious in the first few days, for the first few weeks of class. But if you're applying the principles that we're talking about regularly, then there aren't differences between these classes. There really don't have to be. Now, it may be hard for you to believe given some of the experiences you've had this year, but it really doesn't typically play out that way. So, in the calm phase down, I took it off just to get to this. Calm phase very early on, you get kids who are engaged and responsive and they're compliant and they respond to praise and they're sort of ready for it, which is why when they're calm on a regular basis, we have to notice that. We have to hit them with it because they want to know if I show this behavior, I'm able to get certain responses out of it. And so to maintain the calm, we provide, it's all about the structure and the relationships and positive attention. And then if we have some triggers, again, this is the difficulty for you. You can do everything right in the classroom, and there are triggers that took place before the kid ever hit school today. And I'd say especially, a lot of the consultation we do is for kids on the spectrum. There are triggers that were in place before they got to school, and you just don't know about it until you're saying to emotional support, learning support, others on the team, what the hell happened? Like, where did this come from? This looked really great for the first hour of the day, and all of a sudden it's become something very different. So in school, it can be the difficulty of the task. That can't always change, and it's not likely to change given the curriculum, but the difficulty of the task, or the transitions, or teasing, or other things. And by the way, the teasing by peers, negative interactions, look, we're not going to eliminate this from school. It's been in existence for as long as school has been in existence. But I'll tell you, the kids in middle school and high school will say, boy, there's so much teachers don't see. There's so much there are ways kids do this stuff below the radar. If you talk to a middle school kid about white carding another kid, they just chuckle. They go, it doesn't do much. The white carding, come on, what do they do? Now, we might disagree with that in principle, but the kid's experience of it is, nothing's going to happen from this. Nothing's going to change with this. And so, we want schools to really be looking for the things that kids are able to engage in that at one time are off our radar. But the non-school stuff can be family conflict, and we have a lot, I think as sort of affluent as our district feels, because of its location and because of affiliation with the university and families, in town, we have a lot of kids in school whose families are hanging on to the lowest rung of the ladder, who really are struggling. And now we want them to come in and concentrate and be well behaved for 7-8 hours a day. And we have some families that really are barely hanging on. And so these kids don't have regular routines at home. They're coming in tired. Families are able to sort of keep kids off of them at home through television and movies and video games and all that kind of stuff. But those things are all triggers for how a kid comes into the classroom, starts interacting with another kid who has some means, and whose family may be a little more affluent, and all of a sudden you start feeling like crap because people who are talking about their 2 parents at home and resources at home and the trips the family's just taken or is about to take begin to feel like, I don't belong here. This isn't about me. So some of these things I think often aren't on our radar, but really are part of the triggers that might be in place for a kid, which then leads to a little more agitation that can be accelerated in the classroom. And in the agitation phase is where we sometimes, the kid begins to show up on the radar, right? So these early things, the triggers you don't know about, we don't necessarily see these things occurring. Again, they can happen in the hallway or elsewhere, but when we start to notice it is you get the kid who seems a little less engaged, eyes darting around, fidgety in his or her seat, starting to move a little bit, and it's the first signs that maybe this child is having difficulty. And the other thing is, this 9-month cycle, of the school year, I think is incredibly difficult for teachers because I don't know how long you would argue it takes for you to really kind of know kids, know their triggers, if you have, depending on how many kids you encounter on a daily basis. We're asking you, know the individual triggers, know the families, have some idea of sort of what this kid's existence is, because this is where you're able to jump in and have some, some intervention with this child early on. all right, how long does it take you to get to that point with the number of kids that you end up encountering? All right, now we're into the second half of the school year, and oftentimes it feels like we're just beginning to patch things together and point to next year and what might need to be in place for this child next year, so the next school year starts off better and maybe doesn't head down the same path. And once the child is agitated, there's still an opportunity for engagement here. There's still an opportunity to see it happen. Now again, what teachers sometimes do is see it across the room, monitor, know that something is happening, but just sort of hang on and see what's happening. I'm getting some signs, but we'll wait it out. Maybe it's not going to be one of those days. And you got to put that feeling aside and say, here's an opportunity to actually sort of engage. And this is where knowing the kid helps, because again, kids on the spectrum, that engagement sometimes feels like it's another trigger. Get away from me, I don't want to get near me. There might be specific strategies that we need for where this early intervention is going to take place when a kid is getting agitated. But for kids who aren't necessarily presenting with those kinds of unique needs, things like spectrum needs, it's an opportunity to jump in, decrease some initial frustration, problem solve around what we can do just to bring the agitation down a little bit, bring them a little bit further back down that first part of the slope, and give them a positive thing walking away. Now again, the relationship you have with the kid matters, because they trust that you're willing and able to do that. If their experience of you on a daily basis is, I see him or her doing this, I know that they're capable of it, they've done it with me before, I see them model it with other kids, and I can respond to that. If the feeling is, I fight with this teacher on a daily basis, he or she pushes my buttons, I push his or her buttons, and I know what the cycle is, it's harder for them to respond to what you feel are genuine efforts to want to engage them and bring them back to a different part of this cycle, which is why the sort of more regular implementation of strategies feels pretty important. Once things accelerate, right? So a kid's having difficulty and it's pedal to the metal for where these problems are going. Now they can begin to look for the soft underbelly, right? Kids have a great way of, certainly for us as parents, kids know the soft underbelly. They know what the thing to say that's just going to sort of tick you off as a parent. And they can do the same thing as a teacher. They know what they said that got you agitated last time, what appeared to get you agitated last time, which is why this dispassionate responding is important. Because I think the calmness and the consistency of how we apply things is important for them to witness, not only with them, but with other kids in the class. If they see you doing it in a certain way with other kids, they're less likely to push for the agitation. But this acceleration phase is where they'll sort of push for engagement that begins to create an argument. Keep in mind, function of the behavior matters. So I was talking about sort of attention-getting behaviors, all right? Another, if you've all been involved in the FBAs this year. All right, one of the other sort of big elements is task avoidance. So sometimes kids are pushing for you to get worked up, to get agitated with them, so you'll send them down to MRC, get them out of the classroom in some way, and that works pretty well for them because they've gotten out of the thing that was about to happen in the classroom that they weren't ready to engage in. And we're not looking to get kids, some people think, yeah, but they still had to do the work. I sent it to MRC, they had to make it up later in the day. For some kids, it's very reinforcing simply the fact that they didn't have to do it right now when they weren't ready to be engaged. Even if it was a 15-minute delay, 30-minute delay, something to a later part of the day, that's still very reinforcing for them. So if we understand the function to be escape or avoidance, then there's also a way we want to make sure we engage them in this acceleration phase. And again, this is where the acceleration phase is difficult because this is where those subtle behaviors you saw, the darting eyes and the fidgety behavior in the seat and those sorts of things, is starting to get noticed by other kids in the classroom. And so now you've got an audience. I could be a parent at home, and my screw-ups are typically not noticed by anyone other than the other parent who feels she's going to step in if I don't take something on. In the classroom, it's often difficult because you feel like I've stepped up on a stage to deal with this behavior and I've got 25 sets of eyes on me, all sort of looking for, wow, this is great, what's he gonna do? What's she gonna do? I can't wait to see what this is, wow. You can see them all, they sort of look away from the laptops they often can't look away from, or the iPads they can't take their eyes off of, all of a sudden it's not as interesting as this thing that's starting to play out in the classroom. So other kids start to notice the behaviors during this phase. I think this is difficult. Now this is the psychology stuff that I think sounds better on paper than it often feels when you're implementing, right? This idea that as things are accelerating, I still have an opportunity to intervene, and it's just kind of say, hey, look, I know you're getting frustrated, or it looks to me like you're getting frustrated. How about if we just sort of step away from this for a second? I can give you a few minutes away, then we can get back into it. Something where you have a chance to sort of pull them back from the edge. Difficult at this point because they're often falling into the patterns that are being reinforced, and they're just sort of waiting for the pattern to kind of cycle for you to begin cycling with them. But there still is an opportunity to jump in here. It's really difficult to do when we reach this point, and even more difficult to do when we then hit, this peak phase where kids might be out of control, a little bit aggressive, crying in the classroom. And interestingly, I think one of the trends we've seen in the last sort of 5-6 years is that teachers used to talk about the difficulty of kids who are externalizers in the classroom. So kids who called out, kids who acted up, kids who challenged teachers were defined in the classroom. And I think a big challenge now is the kid who's breaking down, sobbing in the classroom. And we see a lot of those. We certainly see a lot of kids on the spectrum when they become overwhelmed will fall apart in the classroom. And it's a behavior you almost can't believe you're seeing, right? The defiant kid is almost easier to understand, but the kid who's just sobbing in front of peers, who's fallen apart to the point where they can't control themselves anymore, it's often hard to figure out how to sort of intervene in that moment other than I just have to remove this child for his sake or her sake. I need to sort of create a buffer here with the other kids so that they might be able to save face a little bit. This is typically fairly short. Kids don't stay in the peak phase very long because there's a quick intervention and they've really passed the point where some of our early efforts are really going to matter to them. And then it becomes about safety of the students in the classroom, and the schools all have sort of specific responses. Teams often talk about specific responses for kids if they get out of control, sort of how are we getting them out, whose role is it to step in and sort of get them out so that instruction continues to take place. And where do they head? Is it MRC? Is it Mr. McClay's office? Speaking of the school, I spend a lot of time in Mr. McClay's role. But if a child remains in the classroom, if the behavior hasn't caused them to get sent out of the classroom, they can remain in. There really is an opportunity beyond what should be a quick peak phase here to then get them re-engaged and to almost see if we can restart back down at the calm point. Give them an area where they can just be separate for a few minutes, maybe an independent activity. And this is a tough one because I can give you 100 interventions that involve things like that, but in the classroom, that's not the easiest thing to want to implement. That is, I need this work to be done. I have a kid who might actively escape work on a regular basis. I don't want this problem behavior in the classroom to result in my giving him additional escape by being time away. All we're looking for is sort of just a few moments to sort of get himself or herself collected emotionally to then get re-engaged in the activity. It's the moments you're creating where you can reinforce their ability to reconnect, right? If it's catch them being good at home, look for those quiet moments to reinforce. Catch them being good in the classroom. You can sometimes create those moments artificially. I'm going to help this kid calm down temporarily just so that I can reinforce that he or she was able to calm down temporarily and now get re-engaged. And again, easier said than done, but it's also a good model for other kids in the classroom about the need to re-engage in the work. Later on we can sort of debrief with kids, a little conversation about what the heck was going on and maybe what was going on that day. And it doesn't help you in the moment, it's just going to help you tomorrow if you know that fatigue plays a role for this kid, hunger plays a role for this kid, family stuff going on, conflict in the family right now plays a role. The debriefing is far less about today's episode, and a lot of teachers sidestep it because they don't want to get into a discussion, try to sit down and have a nice warm discussion with a kid who's just been outrageous in class, has just been pushing buttons in class. It's not about today's episode. You want to have that discussion in a way that this kid trusts because it's going to help you tomorrow and in future episodes by understanding better sort of where this went, where did things go off the tracks, and how am I going to prevent that from happening or potentially prevent that from happening. Sometimes it's also where if we have counselors involved, emotional support, outside providers, You're not gonna be able to do it, we wanna understand the triggers, because you're not gonna be able to do it unless we can get some sort of connection with the family to make sure that some of the things we think are setting this kid up for a bad day are either addressed at home, and if that's not possible, at least communicated to school coming through the door, so that, you know, you have a little bit of ammo about what to expect on certain kinds of days in school. And, you know, we can talk about the things we would sort of actively avoid. Now, it seems silly to talk about not making humiliating remarks and, you know, negative comments, but I think that, I think we see this far more in the classroom than you would imagine, right? Kids are making your life difficult in the classroom to get through curriculum, the curriculum that you have, and what you want to do is emphasize to a child how this path they're on is not very good, really doesn't mean good things down the road. Like, you know, we have these ways of sort of selling a negative future to a child who's engaged in some problematic behaviors in the classroom, but for a kid who's getting those messages at home already, or already feels like school's just the thing you gotta deal with until you're out of school or can make a decision to choose on your own to be out of school, that's a tough thing to hear. What they really need to know is, can you hang with me? Can you provide me with a model I don't have anywhere else? And actually do that in a reasonably positive way. Even if I'm not giving it as a student, if I'm not giving it to you in a positive way, if I'm not making it easy for you to do that, can you still give it back to me in a way, set something up for me that actually gives me hope that I might be able to engage academically in a way I haven't before. And I do think that's incredibly difficult, and quite frankly, I think the longer you're in the profession, the longer you've been dealing with the problems, the harder it is to want to avoid putting negative behaviors on display, or the harder it is to contain those things and not put negative behaviors on display. Because you just feel like I'm getting beaten up on a daily basis. I didn't sign up for it. I don't feel like I'm getting support from administration. I don't feel like I'm getting parents on board with things. I feel like I'm being asked to take on 3 roles instead of the 1 role I thought this was going to be about. And I can only put so much energy into that. I think it becomes very easy to drift in that direction, as opposed to really sort of staying on message with kids and creating something positive in the classroom. Sometimes that has to do with sort of, you know, your expectations, where you are, your own need for sort of a break, whether administration is providing you with the assistance to sort of have supports in place. I know from sitting in on a lot of team meetings that the way things get constructed in the classroom is often not, you know, not the best way it can be in order to make sure that a teacher has all the supports in place. You've got a lot of staff pulled in all sorts of different directions. Every time, I like to bring up budget, every time the budget numbers come out, everybody starts thinking about, okay, so what does that mean about how positions get reallocated and shifted to different buildings, and, you know, but what that really means is you've got one person handling what sometimes you'd like 2 people or more to handle. So we talk about, you also need to take care of yourself to sort of maintain the ability to carry this energy in. If we go back to the parenting piece, if any of you were in this position, we talk a lot about co-parenting. Right, it's a tag team, so that when you're just, the kid is starting to push your buttons, you tag out, other parent steps in for a second, so I can get a little bit of a breather. But I think it's sort of necessary to make sure you're regenerating your batteries by working with a partner on this stuff. I think being a single parent, it's a reason why often for a single parent it's incredibly difficult, because there's no opportunity to tag out. It's yours 24/7, depending on how much you have the child, but when they're with you, it's 24/7. And I think that it's hard to sort of address these elements, getting rest and all those things, when you're sort of on stage all the time. So we'll go back to this quote about sort of the impact that you have, and again, how important it is, how overwhelming it can feel. And I can just tell you from the perspective of mental health providers that you can give me a kid for therapy. If you want to talk traditional therapy, give me a kid for 1 hour a week, and that's going to have a very limited impact. There's nothing magical that happens in that 1 hour a week. It's a very limited impact compared to what could happen if we're partnering on what can happen during the 7 hours of the day you have them, the modeling that can take place, the reinforcement that can take place, the relationships that take place. And that's far more important for most kids than something magical that's going to be said or processed or experienced in the 1 hour we have. I think more therapy works through the parents when we make changes there, works through the schools when we get them on board with things, and I sort of encourage those relationships as well with others within the school and with providers. All right, so I've sort of gone on, there's not much time left, just a couple of minutes here, but if people had, specific things they wanted to ask about, talk about, I know they put us in the 90-degree room at the end of the long work day, and you can sort of see people who are, ready for either autos or go home and ignore your own children. I have to get home and ignore my kids too, but if people had specific things that they'd like to bring up or address, we have a few minutes anyway. Making it easy. It's because everything's perfect in the classes, right? All the kids are, it's like Lake Wobegon in State College, all the kids are above average.
And so I know that this is kind of a different format than some of the other new teacher inductions that you have experienced throughout the year and that you'll continue to. So I appreciate you kind of humoring us and going with the flow here. The intention of the Summit Project and Brian's involvement really with that is to start exposing school staff that maybe haven't had things in their curriculum in their own education, not necessarily mental health content, but just starting to talk about the emotional health, so the health, the wellness, the state of well-being of our kids beyond the academic pieces, or that really play into and are so interwoven with the academic pieces. So I hope that this gave you kind of a framework and a snapshot to build from, and there will be many more opportunities throughout the course of this year. And hopefully in years to come, where we continue the momentum, continue to offer opportunities and experiences for you all to gain some insight and to share your experiences around student wellness, so student health, mental health.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a base platform. I get that when we come into the schools as providers, we're often working with a team on more specific questions like, what do we do with the fact that our team this year is getting all the kids on the spectrum? Right, because we sort of, especially at the middle school level, one team's going to take them this year, and then the next year somebody else is getting them, and oh my God, sometimes your team gets nailed 2 years in a row for administrative reasons. Sometimes we're doing a lot of work to work with teams on what do you do with the fact that a high percentage of your kids are presenting on a daily basis with challenges, all of which are a little bit unique. And how are we supposed to sort of implement some of these base strategies and address specific behaviors as they come up? And I'd say we spend a lot of time in schools doing exactly that.
No questions?
I'll make one comment so I can do the positive comment.
You get the gold star.
Just move things along. All I was going to say is the sooner that, as a teacher, you figure out that this affective stuff is the key to being more successful with your academic stuff. I really do think that's important. I think as a young teacher, coming out of school, you never really went over, at least when I was going through school, it was a while ago, they spend so little time on this kind of stuff, how to deal with management issues, how to deal with discipline issues. And I really think that, again, the more quickly you address those things in your classrooms and you get that relationship and you learn how to de-escalate problems and you learn how to prevent those things from even occurring, or as much as you can, it makes the curricular side of it much easier to deal with. It's kind of like what you said with the parent, I only have these 5 minutes, well, spend your time front-loading that stuff, and then the payoff will be at the end. Your year will become easier. And, having worked with teachers with this kind of stuff, it is amazing the turnaround you can see when they do that. So it is important for new guys, those of us who are older who have done it before, who have kind of forgotten this. It is important that stuff gets taken care of first, because it does make all the difference.
Well, I'll appreciate your saying that, and two quick comments I'll make. One is the academic piece might be easier to sort of load in once you address some of these things. It's also easier to evaluate, right? You're being asked on a regular basis to figure out whether this kid gets it, can do it, and where we should be sending this kid next year. And I would say it's sometimes very difficult to know what a kid knows and what a kid might be able to learn, because you've got so many behavioral issues in the way. There's so many things playing out that you don't feel like you've really had a normal academic experience with this child. And yet, you're on point to figure out what track they should be on and where they should be going. So I think the evaluation piece is difficult. The other thing is this. Most of us like it when we get the pat on the back for the changes that we're able to see. You made this comment about quick turnaround, and for a lot of kids it can be just that. For kids who come in with behavioral challenges that aren't going to be a quick turnaround, right? The kids who have some really much bigger issues going on and really come from difficult families sometimes. What you're doing in the classroom, the management stuff, might be setting them up for a payoff next year or the year after that. I mean, where the positive things are going to occur for this child on this path might come at a much later point in time, and you're not going to know it, and you're not going to get recognized for what you did this year, and you're not going to get the pat on the back from the family that tells you how much they appreciated that thing, because they're going to assume that it all came some point down the line. But that's not the way it works. This is the platform for some of those positive things that are going to come, where you just don't get to see the change. All you're doing is laying a foundation that somebody else is going to build on, and you just have to know that there's a reason why this was going to be important for this kid, even if you never get to see the payoff. And I think that does happen for a lot of the kids who come in with some really difficult problems in place.